James Bandman Garfield Eichberg, author of Follow My Leader, lived all of his life as a leader himself, forging paths for the rights of the blind and proving the kind of confident, productive life a person can live even without the ability to see. But he wasn't born a leader. In fact, on the day he arrived, September 19, 1881, in Atlanta, Georgia, he followed 8 siblings into the world. The day of his birth happened to be the same day President James Garfield died. He had been shot by an assassin 2 months prior. And Mr. and Mrs. Eichberg named their son in his honor. So Garfield was originally James's middle name. He was born with tunnel vision, and the family doctor predicted that he would go blind very young. Somehow, however, James was able to hold on to his sight for decades. Maybe sheer willpower was a factor, as he was determined to act on stage. After all, performing was in his blood. His uncle was a famous Shakespearean actor, and James loved the theater. In order to follow his ambition, he dropped out of high school, dropped his last name, Eichberg, and moved to New York, where he was able to pick up a Broadway role. His eyesight wasn't great, but good enough to get him onto the stage of which he had dreamed, and then into the Great War, of which he most certainly had not. But once the war and his role as a sergeant major were over, his theatrical leanings branched into radio. James wrote dramas and would eventually act in over 2,000 radio plays. Things were going well. In 1926, his wife Edith gave birth to their daughter Carolyn, and 4 years later, the family moved to Hollywood, California, where James continued a bright career in radio broadcasting. He ranged the field from news dramatization to soap operas. But his health, especially his vision, continued to decline, and soon he was admitted to a home for disabled soldiers. And then 4 years later, his wife Edith passed away, and Carolyn was sent to live in Atlanta with her Aunt Ruby, James's sister. By 1940, James Garfield was completely blind. But that's far from the end of the story. He had much, much more to do in his life, and at age 60, he'd only just begun to serve. He acquired the first of his several guide dogs and went to work in an aircraft plant, where he got to know other blind people and their problems, such as being laid off after World War II when the defense plants closed. Wanting to help, he attended a meeting of the LA County Club of the Adult Blind and was offered its presidency that very night. It was a post he would hold for 12 years as he zealously pursued rights for blind people. In fact, he helped create the California State Board of Guide Dogs for the Blind that year. And remember how James had always loved the theater? Well, soon he was teaching at a radio acting school, helping World War II veterans brush up on their skills to return to broadcasting. One day, one of his students, actor Paul Lukather, took him to his horse farm, where James asked to ride. "You're going to ride blind?" someone asked. And James simply said, "Well, I'm blind, so if I'm going to ride, I'm going to have to ride blind, aren't I?" It's the same sort of scene that played out when he swam, a scene he later recreated for Jimmy in Follow My Leader. Like his namesake in the book, James didn't ever let blindness prevent him from doing what he wanted to do. He strongly believed in the ability and the rights of blind people to do anything they wanted. And he worked hard to promote high standards for California's guide dog schools and the laws now in effect which recognize the traffic and travel status of the guide dog. Well, to publicly emphasize the equality, humanity, and rights of the blind, James began his own program in 1947 called A Blind Man Looks at You on KGFJ in LA. The show would run for 20 years and earned James many awards and honors. It was during this time that James wrote his first book, Follow My Leader, the story of a blind boy and his guide dog, published in 1957, that drew largely on his own experiences. James's daughter Carolyn was in her 30s by the time it was published, but Amy, the youngest of his 2 granddaughters, first read the published book as a 3rd grade class assignment in the 1970s. This is Amy here in her mother's arms. She remembers being proud that her granddad had written it, but what stands out most in her memory is her reaction, the same one of kids across time, that impulse to close your eyes and pretend you're blind, and the relief it is to open them and see. James B. Garfield continued to raise both funds and awareness, and he was in constant demand as a speaker. In his 80s, He was working with his third guide dog, Flora, and had been appointed to the State Board of Guide Dogs for the Blind by 3 consecutive governors. In fact, he continued to serve in official roles well into his 90s. After celebrating his 100th birthday, James moved to Valdosta, Georgia, to be under his daughter's care. He lived on his own with his last guide dog, Coral, until he was 102 years old. And then finally, in 1984, at age 103, this great humanitarian, a man who had given his gifts to audiences, his country, war veterans, the blind, his family, thousands of fans, and millions of readers to come, finally closed his eyes and went into the dark. Thank you, James B. Garfield, for the light you left behind, for writing Follow My Leader, and for opening all of our eyes to the world of the blind, and to the fact that we are all far more capable to meet life's challenges than we think we are. This author biography has been brought to you by LitWits, helping teachers and home educators bring great books to life for kids since 2010. For tons of free creative teaching ideas, plus printables, videos, and online workshops and classes, visit our website at litwits.com. See you there!